Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for gathering this afternoon. I'm Neil Sharpe, Product Marketing Director at Friend MTS, a content protection specialist. Today I'll be talking about protecting premium content, combining the latest anti-piracy technology with tight subscriber management. I'll be covering a number of related key topics, starting looking at the impact of piracy on premium content. Really, this is an existential threat to pay TV platforms, content owners, just looking at what's happening in the market. I'll look at some of the commercial practices that can be adopted to minimize content theft. I'll also turn to the foundational sort of prerequisite content protection technologies before turning to some of the more advanced anti-piracy insight and countermeasures that can be deployed in the face of streaming piracy. Okay, let's start by looking at the impact of streaming piracy on the content owners and pay TV platforms. There was some recent research by Ovum which identified that 13% of TV revenues were to be lost to stream piracy in 2018. And it's probably no surprise to you that the most impacted sectors were premium sports and entertainment. It's a problem that is completely worldwide. It's not unique to any particular market. Obviously some regions are more intensely affected by it, but it is a worldwide problem that impacts the delivery chain all the way from rights holders to the pay TV platforms delivering to the subscribers. One of the things that has happened over recent years is that piracy has become a very sophisticated industrial scale problem. When we look at it, there's like more than 3,000 black market pirate services out there, and they're generating some serious revenue. 260 million of advertising was recently identified. So this is a serious business. It's not like a cottage industry. This has really moved on. This picture here is interesting. It's actually a picture from a police raid done in Kuwait in 2017. It gives you a sense of the scale of streaming piracy, piles upon piles of set-top boxes. This is a major industrial scale problem that really impacts the whole delivery chain. When you look at streaming piracy services, you may be surprised by the sophistication of what's on offer. It's like quite advanced branding presentation, a huge array of channel choice, and a look and feel that mimics the legitimate services. The net effect is that viewers in their home can feel quite at home. It doesn't feel like some illicit service. It feels something that looks very close to a legal service. One of the challenges with streaming piracy is that the technology is very readily available and it doesn't demand a very high level of technical expertise. For example, set-top box content could be stolen, taking the content out of the HDMI output of a set-top box, using sort of devices, HDCP strippers, which are readily available on key shopping sites. So there's a lot of technology out there to enable streaming pirates. And the content can be, once it's taken out, it can be real-time encoded and then uploaded to the internet. Similarly, with OTT content, it's very easy to capture content just as well. It's fast and easy using software tools that are freely available like OBS. It's free tools for encoding and uploading to the internet. I'd now like to look at some of the key developments in streaming piracy, some of the things that we're seeing as we look at the marketplace. What is some of the developments? One of the things we're seeing is a continued move to non-compliant hosts. What's happened is that as more companies have adopted anti-piracy services, pirate services have been pushed away from tier 1 hosts through to sort of tier 2, tier 3. The net effect is that it's making takedown notices much less effective, just because when we're using non-compliant hosts, they're not going to respond to take down the pirate services. The one plus point of this is that when you move away from a tier 1 host, you don't have that scalability, the immediacy of delivering content that you get when you're working with a sort of tier 1 and Akamai equivalent. We're also seeing an increase in peer-to-peer streaming piracy. One of the issues here is that when pirates are using peer-to-peer technology, there's no single IP address that can be used for taking down the content. This means that it really is of fundamental importance to tackle the issue by taking down the redistribution at the source. And this is where technologies like subscriber watermarking fit in. Another thing we're seeing with streaming piracy is a move towards more sophisticated visual manipulation attacks. This is really the sort of the cutting edge of the battleground for video piracy. They're using techniques like collusion, where you're combining multiple video signals to create an image. And the objective here is to undermine the subscriber identification process. And this is where really is an incredibly important that the watermarking, the subscriber identification services are ultra robust to withstand this type of pirate attack. Another thing we're seeing is a higher level of interference with OTT players. There's a lot more tampering going on, and the aim here is to compromise the content protection that's built into the OTT players. One of the responses that is needed here is a much higher level of player hardening to counter this type of attack. Now, I've painted a little bit of a bleak picture here of the scale of a piracy problem. Some of the increases in the sophistication of the services being offered by streaming piracy. But I wouldn't want you to get the impression that this is an impossible problem. This is something that is not insurmountable. If you actually go back to some other data from Ovum, they've actually estimated that piracy losses were actually reduced by 3%. Now, this was driven by a greater deployment of anti-piracy services. And I'll come on to this a little bit later, talking about some of those tangible benefits that we've seen from some of the adopters of anti-piracy technology. Before I get into the technology side of anti-piracy, I'd just like to talk a little bit about some of those commercial practices that can be adopted to strengthen content protection. One of the key things, it may sound obvious, but is to control sales to subscribers of access cards. In some markets, we're seeing that pirates can buy access cards in bulk, without giving their details. So the pay TV services are losing control of their content in that process. So it really is essential to maintain control of that sales process to avoid the setup of fraudulent accounts. Another thing that may sound fairly obvious, but content protection is much easier when you know where your customers are located. Now, in the past, this has been done, with set-top box installation by engineers going to visit the households, going there, installing. And this hasn't just been about installing the equipment. It's also about maintaining that 360 circle of security. So, having a strong handle on the sales process and who your customers are fundamental tenets of effective content protection. Another thing I'd like to talk about is that it's not just the technology that makes a difference. It's making content protection a real priority. And working amongst the teams within pay TV platforms, content owners, to bring the key players together, the commercial teams, the technical teams, because it really does demand an integrated approach to the problem. I'd now like to sort of quickly turn to those sort of foundational content protection technologies, just to provide a little bit of background context before going into a little bit more deeply about the more advanced anti-piracy technologies. Now, one of the things that's very important is that security needs to be enabled right from the production truck all the way to the subscriber. The security implications of the process need to be considered each stage to really manage the process and have a very sort of active operational security mindset. So, it needs all the parties together, the operations team, the engineers to come together and just think through what are the steps of delivering to the home to make sure that security is a key concern at each point. Now, for traditional delivery with set-top boxes, conditional access is obviously one of those core tools in the toolbox. This is combining, scrambling encryption technologies to enforce payments in exchange for accessing particular content. Now, this is obviously an absolute prerequisite for successful delivery and content protection. Equally, in the OTT space, digital rights management is another prerequisite with premium content. Controlling access to copyrighted material. It's slightly different from CA in that it's not like an on-off switch. It's a more complicated process. And it's safeguarding the content from unauthorized use, copying and redistribution. Also important with OTT delivery is client device hardening. This is hardening the device, the app, the player, making it much less susceptible to pirate attacks. And it really stops the compromising of the content by pirates. Another sort of key tool in the toolbox is concurrency management. This is a service that's aimed at stopping the sharing of login credentials. This is obviously you're probably all aware of the sharing of logins for different sort of streaming sites. This is something that undermines revenues and that OTT service providers can control with concurrency management, allowing access revocation and stream termination to sort of keep to much better manage the situation. Okay, that was just sort of the background to some of those core tools that are most familiar, most widely adopted by content owners, pay TV platforms. Advanced anti-piracy insight and countermeasures have been deployed in less broadly than obviously CA and DRM, but they have been widely deployed, especially in markets like Europe, becoming more widely deployed in the United States, also much greater interest in Asia Pacific. So they are worldwide deployment, but some regions are further ahead in the level of adoption. The starting point for advanced anti-piracy services, the sort of foundation typically, is a monitoring service for searching for premium content. One of the issues that content owners, pay TV platforms find is often there's a lack of information about the scale of the problem. How much piracy is out there? What are the key sites that are being looked at? So they can really sort of better understand the threat. And monitoring gives you that data to sort of have a picture of what is happening in the market. Advanced monitoring is it's not based on teams of students working in rooms searching on the internet. It's a highly automated robotic process. The top services are use fingerprint-based content recognition for very fast identification of pirate services. This can be done in literally just a matter of seconds. You can match content to a content owner's content. It's not a random process of just scouring the internet. The process of monitoring involves looking at a library of services where specialists like Friend MTS know where content's been hidden, where it's been hosted rather. And so it's searching for known sites. So it's a very efficient process, but highly scalable. One of the issues with piracy is that the level of piracy is, for a typical weekend match, it can be tens of thousands of sites set up for streaming and redistributing content. So it does demand a highly automated sort of robotic approach that can respond in seconds rather than half an hour or whatever. And it needs to be able to address all the sort of core types of video piracy: Kodi and Android-based illicit streaming services, social media platforms, content sharing by apps, etc. Once content has been identified by monitoring platforms, the next step is typically enforcement against the streaming piracy. This can involve automated sending of DMCA takedown notices to pirates. This is done, at large scale, very, very quickly as soon as the pirate services are identified. But as we mentioned earlier, what we're finding is that typically pirate services are not responding. So the next step, which happens very shortly afterwards, is to escalate the takedown notices to the hosting provider. Now, some of the sort of higher tier hosting providers will respond, they'll take it off, and that obviously addresses the problem. But the real issue with non-compliant hosting is that they're not always going to respond to takedown notices. Another key aspect to enforcement is social media enforcement. One of the things we find is that social media platforms like Facebook, they're the sort of the preferred method for the casual pirate, the person who puts up their mobile phone to share piracy amongst their friends. This isn't the sort of the large scale enterprise that I spoke of earlier, but nevertheless, this is something that impacts the revenues of pay TV providers. So a core part of anti-piracy services is working with those social media platforms. They have their own tools for searching for protecting copyrighted content. And so that content protection specialists will interface with those tools to smooth that process to take that down. Now, one of the newer services that's been announced at NAB is measuring piracy consumption over ISP networks. This is about understanding the impact of piracy on content owners, programmers, pay TV platforms, getting back to that core issue of what is the scale of piracy? How can we measure it? Because there's been lots of estimates, but to identify it accurately has been quite challenging. By actually working with ISPs, we can actually quite accurately measure traffic volumes, the number of people watching, the most used pirate services. So come up with some much more tangible data to address that issue of what is the scale of the piracy problem. Now, once you have that type of data, one of the real benefits is that you can actually use it to look at the impact of content protection services that you're deploying. It can be used as a sort of as a tracking mechanism. So as you deploy different content protection mechanisms in different markets, let's look at the impact on that it's making by measuring the consumption of piracy that we're seeing over ISPs. This is a picture which, let me just step out of the way a little bit, gives you a sense of how this process works for measuring piracy consumption. Here we've got some pirate services that are redistributing content via an ISP to a number of subscribers. We'll see here on the right we've got some of the subscribers are looking at legitimate content, some are looking at the pirate services from the pirate platforms. Now, when a content owner is identifying their content using fingerprinting, that can be very quickly found, that pirate service. And once that pirate service is identified with global monitoring, we can extract the IP address of that service. Once we have that list of IP addresses, they can be then fed through to the ISP's network flow analysis system. And that is how we can output complex, sophisticated reporting on the level of piracy that that's being seen by that ISP in terms of the level of consumption. So I'll now move on to another type of intelligence tool that's a little bit more established, but still very powerful. Distributor level watermarking. Now, this is a service aimed at content owners who are distributing their content to multiple pay TV platforms. And in this case, they may have a requirement to understand which of their platforms are most impacted by streaming piracy. Now, by doing a watermarking across their pay TV platforms, different watermark for each platform, the content owners can very quickly identify which of those platforms that are most impacted, and then consider taking that intelligence of the market, where should I strengthen content protection, taking in extra measures like subscriber watermarking, for example. So it's often used as a first step by content owners who want to better understand the scale of piracy. Now, subscriber level watermarking is obviously one of the most powerful tools out there. It allows identification of the individuals responsible for redistributing content. And then once you have that information, access can be revoked. So this is a tool that is proven to be very effective over recent years. It works even with those most challenging environments of peer-to-peer hosting, non-compliant hosts, where there's a need to take down the source of the content. Now, I'd just like to give you a little bit more feedback about the transformative effect of subscriber watermarking. We worked with a major broadcaster who was the source for, the original source for about 60% of sports piracy in its market. Now, once subscriber level watermarking was introduced into its market, that was reduced down to less than 1% in just a matter of weeks. This shows what a huge impact it can make, transformative, and this is why it's one of the most powerful tools in the anti-piracy armory. Just to wrap up, because I know I'm coming to the end, this is some tweets from people we're seeing in the market who have been subscribing to pirate services, who've had access denied. We see quite a lot of amusing comments about people losing their content, unable to find a stream as the content is cut off, with the subscriber watermarking kicking in. This is just to sort of give you a flavor of it really works and it makes a difference in the market. Just to wrap up, I'd just like to say with anti-piracy and content protection, you will experience much greater success when multiple tools are brought together. Each supports another. And to quote Aristotle, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. So this is an area where multiple technologies need to come together, multiple teams need to come together, and when that happens, a huge difference can be made to the streaming piracy landscape. Look, thank you for listening. I hope that was useful. If you're interested to learn more about some of those latest developments in terms of measuring streaming piracy consumption, the different roles of distributor watermarking, subscriber watermarking, do come through and see us at Friend MTS. We're at booth SU8921, not very far by. So thank you very much.